Thank you. Keep moving it.
I have to hit OK. Welcome to another speaker series program sponsored by the Woods and Wetlands Group of the Illinois Sierra Club. My name is Rosemary Heileman, and I will be your host this evening. I want to put OK, and I can't. All right, I'm going to. Our program meetings feature speakers on topics relating to our environment, stewardship, wildlife and nature, public policy, and anything about outdoor activities like hiking and canoeing, bird watching, and so forth. In a minute, we will hear from our featured speaker, Mike Wurtz of the University of the Pacific. First, we have a couple of brief announcements. As Doug said, we are recording this so you can watch it in the future. Turn off your camera if you don't wish to appear on the video. We will send out the YouTube address for the program later this week so you can watch it again. Before we begin, make sure you are muted, especially if you have a barking dog, a television, or other commotion in the background. Please feel free to ask any questions of our speakers this evening by using the chat room at the bottom of your screen. We will select questions afterwards, and they will be directed to Mike. Although Mike has said that he might be asking some questions of you as the program goes on. Now let's move on to our April featured speaker. Mike Wurtz is an archivist and the head of the University of the Pacific's Holt-Atherton Special Collections and Archives. He oversees access, acquisition, and the preservation of over 1,000 archival collections, as well as the largest collection of John Muir material in the world. As you know, of course, John Muir is a famous environmentalist and the first president of the Sierra Club. Mike holds degrees in history, geography, and library science. He teaches courses and gives presentations about Muir, and he worked with Muir to create the John Muir's Grand Yosemite, a guide to where Muir made his drawings of the park, and he is awaiting publication of an article about Muir and the giant sequoias. He's been a member and volunteer for the Sierra Club for a long time and was recently voted to his local group's executive board. We welcome you, Mike. Turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. Yeah, if anybody has any advice, please put into the chat. If you have any advice about being on a local group's executive board, we'll see how that goes. But thank you so much for having me this evening. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, I spent about a year in Chicago, nearly 40 years ago, but I still think fondly of Chicago, and I do miss it. So yeah, so I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions, and let's go ahead and get started here and see what we can come up with. I'm gonna do one more thing here. There we go. Okay. So yeah, welcome everybody. There's so much that we can say about John Muir, and it'll be kind of fun with having Harold Wood here because he'll probably troubleshoot some of the things that I have to say. But this person is, John Muir is just really kind of basically changed how we saw the environment. Up until Muir came along, there were probably two main things that people thought about when they saw the environment, when they saw nature. In fact, if you're feeling especially ready to go, go ahead and drop in one or two words, what did people think of the environment before people like John Muir came along in the 1800s? I'll give you just a moment here. Actually, I'll start introducing what's going to go. So tonight we're going to be talking about how, that I see when I talk about Muir, I kind of see these three different phases of his life. I have this early part of his life, which is wandering. That's kind of the Saunterer. And then there's the middle part where he's really focused on science, and that's studying it. And then lastly, his savior part, and that's protecting it. And I kind of put Muir into these little things. So tonight, I'm going to tell some stories, and I'm going to show some stuff from the archives. But you'll also see that Muir's, sauntering, science, and savior is kind of like all parts. It's kind of all flowing together, but I kind of see them, that they can kind of mush together. Yeah, so excellent, Rosemary. Yeah, Same with you, June. Excellent. There's two main things that people, I think, kind of looked at nature before people like John Muir came along. And one, as a resource, what can we cut down in this forest or whatever? And the other is that it was scary. It was a scary place to go. But Muir made us see these things completely different and said that we need nature for nature's sake. Okay. All right, so a little bit more introduction of John Muir and who he was. Most of these things are, pretty standard. And this is, how did he do all this? It's again through that early revelry, and then, really focusing on the science, and then also the preservation. Again, these are all kind of mixed together, and you're going to hear a little bit of, preservation and science in the revelry part, et cetera, et cetera. You'll hear it all. But when I look at this list, the thing that really strikes me the most is that premier 19th century writer. That to me is the one that really hooks the most. I mean, he did a lot of really amazing things, but his power and influence was really from his writing. And that's where we really become enraptured by his stories. And hopefully we'll hear a couple of those this evening. So why, who am I? Despite my introduction, we have his stuff, and it's a lot of stuff. As you can see there, it's thousands of letters and journals and notebooks and you name it. And all this material used to, of course, John Muir had it at first. When he died in 1914, it kind of passed on to his biographer, William Frederick Baudet, who we were talking about a little bit earlier. And Baudet was associated with the Pacific School of Religion that was in Berkeley, California. So the stuff kind of was in his house and at the Berkeley School. Finally, it migrated over to UC Berkeley, where it spent about 15 years. And then in 1970, at this point, about a handful of John Muir's descendants had gone to the University of Pacific. And so when they were looking for a new place to put John Muir's stuff, they said, let's put it there at the University of Pacific. And it came here in 1970. And the main thing that we do as archivists is provide access to this material. We want people to look at it. And we do this in a number of ways. The most important among those is we put things online. If you have any questions about anything I say tonight, obviously I'm willing to answer those. But if you're like wondering, wait a minute, how does that quote go? And I wonder where that came from. This is all the stuff that we put online. You can read his correspondence, his journals. You can look at it, so much of it online. And of course, we also, if you want to come in and take a look around, you can do that too. What's really cool about what's online is that you'll see that we've got his journals online, and they've been transcribed. So you can not only keyword search them, but if you're very intrepid, you can also help us transcribe some of them. Some of them we have not yet transcribed. So we're always looking for people to go in there and read John Muir's writing and tell us what it says. Then we can put it online and make it more available. More people can search for keywords and such. Another thing that we do is we created the Muir Experience. It's a museum-like space right in our library lobby at the University of Pacific. This is really cool. In addition to John Muir's archival materials that I've already told you about, and we're going to see a lot of today, we also have John Muir's book collection, which is in these bookcases. And the two bookcases that are closest to us on the left and right belonged to John Muir. And so did that writing desk kind of in the back left there. And then the two paintings on the wall also belong to John Muir by his friend William Keith. We use this space for all sorts of programming. It's basically to kind of immerse you into Muir's mind, and that is through books and through the environment, as you can see from the pictures on the walls. And we do this in so many ways. We kind of spread his word, obviously through online, but we also convey his words, pretty much like me giving a presentation today. We also have classroom instruction. That's me taking a class to Yosemite last year to talk about John Muir. We also have a symposium every now and then too. So we're always getting his word out, and people publish on it. Ken Burns used a number of our items when he did his documentary about the national parks. And then sure enough, there's my book there too. I've done some research, and we'll circle back to that. I promise I'll talk more about it. So let's talk about John Muir now. Muir was born in Scotland. And as you can see from there, when he was a boy, he was fond of everything that was wild. But he had kind of a rough childhood, and that's really mostly due to his father, who was a very, very religious man. And Muir once said, that his father made me learn so many Bible verses every day, but by the time I was 11 years of age, I had about 3/4 of the Old Testament and all the New Testament by heart and by sore flesh. Muir's father, almost literally beat the Bible into him. We see that in Muir's writing quite a bit. You see those religious terms and spiritual terms that were pretty much from Muir's reading the Bible. But he also says, typical in the old Scotch fashion of whipping for every act of disobedience or simple playful forgetfulness was also his father's way. When they moved to the Wisconsin farm, when Muir was about 10, 11 years old, his main job was working. He had to work at that farm all the time. And so that was a pretty rough childhood that Muir had. But it also inspired him to invent. And this is a drawing of John Muir's in the middle. And then on the left side there, that's one of John Muir's books. He writes in a lot of them. It's really cool stuff, by the way. We're getting ready to put some of that online. But you can also see that this is a time where Muir is kind of learning, and he's starting to make inventions and things like that. And if you look really closely at that drawing, I've actually blown it up for you. You can see on the side of the house that he's created it looks like probably a thermometer and probably a clock up there that he invented himself. He made these things out of wood. So he was kind of like very focused on science, even as as a boy. He really wanted to do that. And these inventions eventually made him well known enough that he went down to Madison, Wisconsin to show off his inventions. And that's when he caught the eye of some people that lived there and ended up at the University of Wisconsin. At the age of 23, he finally makes it back to school. While he was there, he studied mathematics and natural science. He picked up some botany as well. But he continued to invent. The main thing that he invented from this time period, and it's still there at the University of Wisconsin, is this desk clock. And this is kind of an interesting, the way it's set up. Basically, Muir could put all of his books right there where it says desk clock. He'd put his books that he needs to read, and then each book would get pulled up and set on a little open up like a book, of course. It would open up and then it would turn the pages at the rate that Muir wanted to read it at. So he could get all his readings done for all of his classes. He also invented some other things, but first, he only went to school for a couple of years, but then he decided, as he writes, I wandered away on a glorious botanical and geological excursion, always happy and free, poor and rich, without thought of diplomas or making a name, urged on and through endless inspiring godful beauty. For I was only leaving one university for another, the Wisconsin University for the University of the Wilderness. And off he went on his botanizing trips. And he also had some jobs in places in inventing and that sort of thing. And I believe that this thing on the left was probably from that time period. This is called a loafer's chair. And the way that this worked is that if you sat in this chair and you loafed in it, and you started to lean back or whatever, it would actually fire a pistol off from underneath you and wake you up. And so Muir had this loafer's chair to kind of keep him, that would keep people alert. But anyway, he got started off on his botanizing trip deep into the woods of Canada. And also, actually, he wandered around the Midwest before going up into Canada. This is when he first comes across the Calypso borealis, a beautiful flower that he'd been searching for a very long time. This ended up actually being the topic of his very first article that was ever published. It was published by a friend of his in the Boston Recorder. He lived up in Canada for a little while, and then finally the company that he was working up there, by this point, he's an efficiency expert, could go into a business and say, if you move this around and you do that differently, you can produce more of whatever you're trying to make. But anyway, that particular factory that he was in burned down, and so he made his way to Indianapolis, Indiana. He moved down there for a couple of reasons. One, the most important reason is that he knew that it was a very verdant area. There was lots of trees and plants that he could look at, that he can continue to botanize. But he also found a job there in a carriage factory, and so he worked at this carriage factory for a little while. One evening, he was working in the carriage factory, and one of his responsibilities was to tighten the belts. So you can see this is a picture of a belt here on the left, And you can see that little knot there. Now that's a pretty easy knot to take apart, but the one that Muir came across was especially tight. And so he thought, well, if I take that sharp end of the file, as you can see those file examples there, the one that usually goes into the handle, if I take the sharp end of that and jam it into that knot, I can open up that knot and pull the thing closer together and make it really, really tight and make this better. Well, he had that file and he was pushing on it really hard there, and something happened. It slipped and fell, and it flipped around or whatever, and it goes bam right up into his right eye. And he stops for a minute and he puts his hand out. The file falls to the floor and he puts his hand out and he opens up his eye and he's looking with his left eye down, and he can see the aqueous humor dripping out of his right eye into his hand. Thinking the same thing I am. Anyway, he cups his hand gently. He wanders home to where he's staying at that time. By the time he gets home, his left eye goes sympathetically blind. And he's kind of thinking about his life at this point. And a doctor comes in and says, I don't think you're going to get your eyesight back in your right eye. Your left eye will probably come back, but I don't see hope for your left or your right eye there. Fortunately for us, John Muir's eyesight did recover fully only after about 3 weeks in darkness. But it was in that darkness that he got to thinking about his life. There are factories and there's botanizing. There are factories and botanizing. What do I want to do more? And he writes much later, he says, I made haste with all of my heart, bade adieu to all thoughts of inventing machinery, and determined to devote the rest of my life to studying the inventions of God. And so that's, Muir is heading out into nature now. And the very first thing that he does is, well, he runs home quickly back to Wisconsin to see his family, gather some things together, and takes off on his famed 1,000-mile walk to the Gulf. He's going to go off. And this is the original journal that we have. You can also read this book. It's online. It's everywhere. If you ever want to read anything like this, you can see it. And he goes off on this 1,000-mile walk, but you can see that even when he writes his address down, for lack of a better term, you can see that he's already he wants to see the world differently. He sees, instead of putting John Muir and putting an address, he says, Earth, planet, universe. He's now become this, he's now transcending space and time. And basically, he's on this tour of the South. He wants to observe plants and animals and people, and so off he sets. Well, right off the bat, he gets started in September of 1867. And there he is. He's kind of spreading out a map, and he's written, the world was all before them, where to choose. And this is a quote from Milton's Paradise Lost. Muir only carried a few books with him, at least he says so. A copy of Burns's poems, Robert Burns, a famous Scottish poet or writer, a copy of the Bible, of course, and Milton's Paradise Lost, which we have a copy of in our collection, which you can see there. He's written in the back which passages he wanted to return to. But as he writes himself about this, he says, I shouldered my little bag of plant press and strode away among the Kentucky oaks, rejoicing in the splendid visions of pines and palms and tropical flowers and glorious array, not, however, without a few cold shadows of loneliness. So off he went, and he started to run a little bit. He was getting a little tight on the funds, and so he ended up in Savannah, Georgia, when he got really tight on the funds, and he said, I need to find a place to sleep tonight. I don't have any money. I suppose I could go off in the forest. And mind you, this is right after the Civil War. And so he thought, what would be a real ideal place for the penniless wanderer? He says, there is no superstitious, prowling mischief makers dare venture for fear of a haunting ghost. And if you look really carefully, you might see where he decided to spend his nights while he was waiting for his family to send him more money. If you look on the left-hand side of that drawing there, sure enough, you see a headstone. So Muir is actually sleeping in a cemetery for a little bit there while he's waiting for money to come through. This is a close-up of that same image again. And you can see some of the trappings of John Muir. You can see his hat there, and you can see his plant press. I've put a plant press there so you can see what it looks like. Maybe his bag, and then a gigantic grasshopper and another bug there. The reason why I like this image so much is that Muir had such a delicate hand when drawing plants, But when it came to animals and people, he developed it much later. He got to be very good. But at this time, he's still trying to work on people and plant and animals a little bit there. This is another one from his Buenaventura home. This is that cemetery that he lived in. You can see another tombstone there. But if you look really carefully, and I'll go back to the last slide too, if you look really carefully, what do you think those little dots are around his head? Go here again. If you want to throw that into the chat, what do you think those little dots are around his head? He later said that he was exposed to unhealthy vapors. We'll continue. We'll continue this story. You can throw in there what you think those little dots are around his head. This is kind of a good guess, no seams. This is kind of a transformative time in Muir's life. I mean, he has a lot of transformative moments, but this is a real transformative moment in Muir's life as far as animals are concerned. And he began to see that they're all part of the whole system, whether we consider them scary animals or good animals, you know, that they all have a place in the ecosystem. And he writes here, I think that most of the antithopes which haunt and terrify us are morbid productions of ignorance and weakness. I have better thoughts of those alligators now that I've seen them at home, honorable representatives of a great saurians of an older creation. May you long enjoy your lilies and rushes and be blessed every now and then with a mouthful of terror-stricken man by way of dainty. Now, I don't think Muir actually witnessed this, but I think it's kind of a wish that he has, that, you know, he hopes that every now and then you get a chance to have a little bite of man. Okay, there we go. Mike and June. Yep, you nailed it. We're going to come back to that in a minute. On this trip, Muir also, as I mentioned earlier, he observed the people. He talked to a lot of people. He stayed with a lot of people. He even met some blacks along the way. Now, at this time, you know, the United States was, you know, very much steeped in derogatory language, and Muir reflected some of that. He used terms about the blacks that he met, about them being lazy or, you know, dirty and things like that. And, you know, when we try to look this into a larger context, yes, he did use these derogatory terms against blacks at that time. But there's a number of things to keep in mind. This is, you know, this is a time of, you know, that the blacks had been enslaved for over 200 years. And then, you know, what I do encourage when people come across these writings of Muir is to kind of, you know, not only look at the word that he's using, read the sentence, read the paragraph, read the context, kind of keep zooming out. Think about the time that it was written, think about what other people were saying at the time, and it helps to make sense. The words are still there. He did use that language, but it helps to kind of help to look this in context. And, you know, the history, you know, once you really take a deep dive into this, you'll find that it can be nuanced and it can be ambiguous and vague. So yeah, you remember those mosquitoes back there in the cemetery? Well, it was about 14 days later, and typically the incubation for malaria is about 7 to 30 days, but about 14 days later, Muir ends up in Cedar Keys, Florida, where he gets deathly ill from malaria. And I love this. He actually has a little chart there showing how close he was to death during those 2 months of recovery at Cedar Keys. And then below that is a drawing that he made of, I believe it's Lime Key. I'd have to go back and look it up to be sure. So yeah, Muir was, you know, definitely seeing things a little bit different now. You know, he decides that maybe this is not for him. Maybe he should move on. And so his original idea is he really wanted to follow in the footsteps of the famous naturalist Alexander von Humboldt, actually polymath, and you know, who did a lot of different things, but he really wanted to follow his footsteps to South America. But Muir got so sick and he kept thinking about California and how beautiful it was. And he's like, you know, I should probably go to California now. So he hopped a boat, but first he went to Cuba for a little bit. He was there for a little while and he messed around there. And you can see a page from his journal at that time. This is the snake cactus. If you look really carefully, you can see that cactus kind of roams around like a snake, and he made that drawing. And then he took another boat up to New York, and then took another boat from New York to the Isthmus of Panama, across the Isthmus of Panama, which, by the way, is a subject of yet another journal, which you can look at online. Sailed up the west coast of North America till he got the streets of San Francisco. And when he got there, he's like asking people, what's the quickest way out of town? And somebody finally said, well, where do you want to go? And then that's Muir's one of his most famous lines, anywhere that is wild. And you'll find that is even changed a little bit over the years. You see a number of different ways. So then he decides, okay, that's it. He wants to go to someplace wild. They say, go that way. He already knows that he's going to Yosemite. So he sets off across the Central Valley of California, not too far from where I'm sitting right now. He makes his way across the central part of California, going to the most amazing, most stupendous, most beautiful place that anybody has ever seen on Earth. Oh, darn it. Sorry about that. I need to fix that slide. He ends up in Yosemite in 1868. Just about 30 years old. He gets there, and again, he's starting to get a little bit, he's getting a little bit low on funds. And so he says, he writes, he spent about 8 or 10 days in visiting the falls and the high points of view around the walls, making sketches and collecting flowers and ferns before he headed back to the Central Valley of California. When he gets back to the Central Valley of California, he gets a job with a rancher, and this is a drawing from near where he was living, and he gets this job, but he gets this really kind of today you could probably call it a pretty nice gig. Basically, this guy said, "Hey, what I want you to do is I want you to follow my shepherd as he goes clear up into the High Sierra, the highest points of Yosemite, what is now Yosemite National Park. I want you to go clear up there, follow this guy around, take all the time you want to look at the flowers and the things that you're interested in." Muir's like, absolutely. And this became the subject of one of Muir's most famous books, and that is My First Summer in the Sierra. A great read. Probably, I think if I had to pick a favorite Muir book, I think this might be it. So off he went up into the Sierra. And he has lots of exciting adventures out there, but he heads back up. And one of the things that he really likes to do is he really likes to be immersed in nature. He wants to feel that excitement of being on the edge of a cliff or whatever. And so he gets right up to the edge of this waterfall, and he stands there and he says, while perched on that narrow niche looking down, he wants to know what it's like to be a waterfall. I was not distinctly conscious of danger. And he stood out there, and he was a little concerned about his safety, but he finally decided that it was time to go back to camp for the night. Well, all night long, he kept dreaming that he was falling into Yosemite. Again and again, he dreamed that he's falling off this precipice into this grand valley. And one time, he springs to his feet and he says, "This time is real. All must die. And where could a mountaineer find a more glorious death?" And this quote has resonated with me ever since I was a teenager when I first read it. And it makes me think, I mean, this is certainly no encouragement to go off into nature and get hurt and die or anything like that. But it does make me think about the choices that we can have in life. I mean, would I rather accidentally fall off a waterfall, or would I rather, be crossing Michigan Avenue in downtown Chicago to get that really great piece of pizza? I think I'd choose being out in nature. This gives you a little context of exactly how high he was up off the ground there. There was, 1,500 feet immediately below him on the upper fall, and then 2,500 feet for the entire Yosemite Falls. So yeah, Muir had some pretty adventurous times out there. He eventually made his way across the Sierra Nevada, and he's making his way here. You can see off in the distance Mono Lake, which you may have heard of before. Mono Lake is quite famous because Los Angeles was taking water from the streams that ran into Mono Lake. Anyway, he crosses over here, and now we come across another thing it's been something that we need to be aware of John Muir, and that when he crossed over the Sierra, he met some Native Americans that were coming the opposite direction, and they surrounded him, and they were begging for whiskey and tobacco. And at this time in his life, Muir is meeting these people, and he's scared for one, but frequently he would use terms that we would not use today and really kind of equates the Native Americans with being dirty. Now, there's a whole bunch of things we can get into this. There have been entire symposia based on, what Muir said about California natives at the time. But again, I encourage you to kind of think about, the context and everything else like that. For example, Native Americans, by the time he met the California natives, there was over 100 years of brutal missionization going on. And then there'd been 20 years since the California gold rush. So the Native Americans that Muir met were probably just, mere echoes of themselves as they'd actually been all this time. So again, I do recommend if you find a passage of Muir's that you find that might, that you're like, wait a minute, why is he using this language? Keep reading, try to understand the context, the full context of what's going on. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, I said I was going to be talking about this revelry in science and preservation. It's kind of all there. We've been talking about that revelry part early on, but I feel like this letter here, this is a letter from our collection, where Muir really goes deep into the woods. In fact, he writes, I am in the woods, 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 and they're in me, ee. And you can see that he's so deep in nature that he's writing this letter from Squirrelville at nut time. So if you ever wondered, Squirrelville at nut time, this is going so deep into nature. This is up, by the way, my favorite letter in the entire collection. One time he writes, the king tree and me have sworn eternal love. He's talking about the giant sequoia tree here. He's sworn it without swearing. I've taken sacrament with Douglas squirrel. I've drank sequoia wine, sequoia blood. And with its rosy purple dress, I'm writing this woody gospel letter. John Muir is actually using the tannin from the giant sequoia cone as ink. So he's writing this letter using ink of nature. And, Squirrelville, nut time, ink, you name it. He also writes, I wish I were so drunk and sequoiacal that I could preach the green-brown woods to all the juiceless world, descending from the divine wilderness like John Baptist, eating Douglas squirrels or wild honey or wild anything, crying, repent, for the kingdom of sequoia is at hand. So Muir is like very, very much deep into this revelry part of his life. But this is also when Muir is moving on to the next part of his life, and that is, here we go. And that is, this love of trees and mountains, but he really starts to, he always wanted to understand nature too. So he really starts to think about understanding nature. So I got another quiz for you. We're looking at Yosemite Valley, and all three of these drawings are in my book. It's called the John Muir's Grand Yosemite, and you get drawings of John Muir that he made of Yosemite, tells you how to get there. There's a little quote by me, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of things to see there. But anyway, and I'll be sure to drop a link in the chat, or if not, you can just search my name and Muir and Yosemite, and you'll find the book. Anyway, so what did Muir think, or how did people think Yosemite was created before Muir came along? Before Muir came along, how did people think Yosemite Valley was created? If anybody wants to throw that into the chat, and I'll continue plugging my book. And I should have got the link to it, but anyway, it's a pretty fun little book. I'll give you a moment here. Okay. Well, I know you're all frantically typing into your chat or as Muir quoted, it was believed that the bottom of the valley sank down to an unknown depth owing to its support being withdrawn from underneath. So before Muir came along, Muir thought Yosemite Valley was created by earthquakes. Linda, there you go. God had something to do with it. But yeah, they felt that earthquakes kind of made this valley happen, and the sinking of the land and subsistence and that sort of thing. But Muir looked at it differently. He started to read, as it says here, he started to read the topography, and he would see things like glacier erratics. He'd see those rocks just sitting out in the middle of something. He'd see the glacier moraines, and he'd also see my favorite topographic thing is that glacial polish that you can see in that picture on the right, where the glaciers is smoothed so down. So Muir said, I think glaciers created Yosemite Valley, and he even started drawing about it. This is another drawing that John Muir made of Half Dome, and you can see that he's making these drawings here to say this is what happened, is that glaciers created the valley. Another thing that was going on at that time is that the state geologist, said that Yosemite was created by earthquakes. State geologist also said the high country, yes, that was created by glaciers, but the glaciers are no longer there. So this is another big contribution of John Muir's to science, especially glacial science. These are called roches montagnaises. And for those of you that speak French, you're probably saying, what did he say? Roche meaning rock, montagnais meaning sheep, and that these rocks kind of look like sheep when there's a bunch of them. But basically, the glacier goes over the top, in this case, from the right to the left. It goes over the top of these rocks and smooths them off on one side and cracks them off on the other. So these things are all over the place. But again, state geologists said, no, no, there are no glaciers. They're not here anymore. So Muir is like, wait a minute. I think we've got a couple things to talk about here. So what he did is he crawled up into this glacial valley, or this valley, and he noticed that there was snow everywhere. And he's like, well, how am I going to measure this, that it's still a glacier? So he found these sticks. Well, he had these sticks, and he placed them across the front of the glacier, or what he thought was a glacier, at least in the snowfield there. And then what he did is he came back about a couple months later and found that they'd all moved down. Thus, they're living glaciers. They are actually moving in the direction that Muir put these things. This is the journal page, and you can see at the top he has them pointing upward, but that he finally deduced by seeing where those stakes had moved. These ice masses are seen to possess true glacial motion. So Muir made two really big contributions to the understanding of the glacier environment of Yosemite. Yosemite Valley, created by a glacier, and as well as other things, but the high country, that those glaciers are still there. Not so much today, but in Muir's time, they were still there. Another big contribution to science is he really wanted to understand the giant sequoia trees. And so, interestingly enough, that same Josiah Whitney, who is not quite sure about Muir's ideas about glaciers, had written about these giant trees. And he says, they're wonderful. He says, they're not that wonderfully exceptional thing, which popular writers have almost described them as being. But Muir is like, I want to learn about the science of these, really getting into the science. And he writes, he wants to go into the home of the sequoia and learn what I can of their conditions and prospects, their age, stature, and the area they occupy. He wanted to know where they were, and most importantly, he wanted to know if they're going extinct. And so off he set on this grand 2.5-month trip wandering through. But here we also start to get the beginnings of his Samaritan, the one who wants to preserve things. And he writes, he's wandering through these woods, but waste and pure destruction are already taking place at a terrible rate. Unless protective measures are speedily invented and enforced, in a few years, this noble tree species of the world will present only a few hacked and scarred remnants. And he also writes this, a very famous quote that was even used in the advertisement for the program this evening. He says, any fool can destroy trees. They cannot run away or defend themselves, and if they could, they would be destroyed like buffalo, chased and hunted down as long as fun or a dollar could be got out of their bark hides, their leafy branching horns, or magnificent bull backbones. God has cared for these trees, saved them from drought, disease, avalanche, and 1,000 straining, leveling tempests and floods. But he cannot save them from sawmills and fools. This is left to the American people. But we got to remember, Muir's got more of a life than just trees and glaciers. He does get married, has a couple of daughters, and he ends up spending a lot of time on the managing his father-in-law's fruit ranch, quite successfully, I might add. And this is I love this. This is a letter that he wrote to a friend of his, showing what he looks like. He says he looks like a chaparral or something like that. But anyway, he's still pretty itchy. He still wants to learn more about glaciers. And this is when he sets off on his trips to Alaska. In 1879, he takes his first one, and he goes to Alaska 7 times in the next 20 years. He really wants to see glaciers in their living lab. And he writes on this particular drawing, he says, the mills of God grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. He makes he does a lot more observing, not only of glaciers and plants and animals, but of people again. And he meets the native Alaskans and has a much different story to tell about that. A lot of that might be due to the fact that the native Alaskans, they hadn't been genocided pretty much like the other groups that we've been talking about. Um, and the only real impact was a lot of missionization that was going on at that time. So yeah, Muir had a much different experience than the earlier ones. These are a couple of drawings that he made, even of the totems that he saw there. This little drawing here in the lower right, that's a drawing that a little boy made of John Muir that put into John Muir's notebook. This is also the scene of his most famous of all his stories, and that's the adventure with a dog and a glacier. And Muir, this is a really classic, how does Muir get our attention and tells us how to understand nature? Well, here's how the story goes. Muir is setting out one day. He's at camp. There's a dog in the camp, and he sets off and he's going to go on this 10 to 20 mile walk on the glaciers. By the way, the weather is absolutely dreadful that day. It's raining, it's snowing, it's just awful. And this dog is insisting on coming with him. And he's like, stay here. I'm going to go up to these ice fountains and nearby peaks. So he starts his way up what is now called Brady Glacier. And this dog is begging, saying, I'm going to follow you. And Muir's like saying, stay back in camp. Finally, Muir writes, the pitiful wanderer just stood there in the wind, drenched and bleaking, saying doggedly, I'm sure everybody that has a dog understands this, where thou goest, I will go. So last I told him to come on if he must. I gave him a piece of bread I had in my pocket, and then we struggled on together, and thus began the most memorable of all my wild days. And this is a really great read. If you get the chance, it's a short read. Some versions are as little as 20 minutes. You can find them on the Sierra Club website. You can find them everywhere. And it's a great story. That dog there that John Muir's got his hand on, that's Keene, short for Stikine. This is a different dog that Muir had, not the famous Stikine, but he had a dog named Keene as well. This is a drawing out of the notebook from that particular trip. Pretty sure that little black blob there is probably Stikine when they got back to their site that night. But it's important to remember that this story is about a dog, which is really exciting and fun and attractive, and I want to read about a dog for sure. But Muir also knew that he can use these stories, these sauntering stories, to promote learning, science, and preservation, his savior aspect too. So, he'd write about a dog and a glacier, but the real point was to tell people that we should be protecting these environments and studying them. Even when he continued to study the glaciers, and this is a real interesting quote that I found, or somebody had turned me on to years ago. But you can see that Muir's kind of already noticing that things are changing climate-wise. He says, every glacier in the world is smaller than it once was. All the world is growing warmer, or the crop of snowflowers, those are his words for glaciers, the snowflowers is diminishing. So he's noticing this warming trend in our environment. And so now this is another big turning point in Muir's life. We've been talking a little bit about preservation. Now we're going to explode into preservation, all due to this guy, Robert Underwood Johnson. He was one of the editors for the famous Century magazine. And Johnson, really said to Muir, now Muir had been married about 9 years at this time. And Johnson said, we really need to, let's see if I get that going there. You need to do what you can about preserving natural spaces. You've got the pen, people listen to you. Let's do more about that. And so Muir and Johnson headed high up into the high country, and this is along the Tuolumne River. This is a place called Water Wheel Fall. And as you can see, it looks like a water wheel, and there's Muir's drawing with Johnson and Muir there in the foreground at Water Wheel Fall. And they had some really wonderful campsites up in the high country, and they talked about what can we do for the environment? And this really spurred Muir to really do a lot more. And the two really big things that he did at this time, shortly after that, is one was the establishment of Yosemite National Park. That's pretty much the blue boundary there. Also, thank you, John Muir, and everybody can thank him if you want. Establishing the Sierra Club. He helped to establish that There were people that are saying, hey, we should put this thing together and we should get John Muir and we should make him our first president. And of course, Muir says, yeah, we should do this, like hoping that we'll be able to do something for wildness and make the mountains glad. So we attribute, Muir is a very important figure, of course, in the Sierra Club. Yeah, thank you, Chris. Very good new book called Guardians of the Valley that just came out, or actually came out a couple, 3 years ago, but it really explores that relationship between Muir and Robert Underwood Johnson. But Muir is also starting to do a lot of world traveling. This is the early 1890s. He takes his first big trip, and I'm putting this one in special for you Chicago people, because this is Muir at the Columbian Exhibition. Now, candidly, I'm not 100% sure that's Muir. I really think it is. But this is him at the Columbian Exhibition right there at Jackson Park in 1893 before he headed off onto his world trip, or one of his first trips. I'm sorry, this one was specifically to Europe. He sauntered around his hometown in Scotland. He went up into the Alps to look at the science, and then he also did a little bit of preservation, trying to learn about other things. About 10 years later, he's back at his preservation again. He's pretty well known. He's about to go on another trip, and he gets this letter from Theodore Roosevelt saying, "Hey, come with me to Yosemite." He says, I don't want anyone with me but you, and I want to drop politics absolutely for 4 days. Good luck getting Muir to drop politics for 4 days. Anyway, interestingly enough, that's a draft response that Muir has there on the right, and it says, I see by the newspaper that the president's little raid into Yosemite is to be made after the middle of May. I shall not, therefore, be able to join in. I'm sorry to say, convey my regrets. So Muir at first said, yeah, thanks, but no thanks. I got other plans. But, you can imagine the president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, being quite convincing. And off they went to this wonderful 3-day trip to Yosemite with Muir. And you can see Roosevelt saying, need not tell you of the wonderful time that we had, where he camped and all that sort of thing. And that's Muir and Roosevelt at the base of the giant sequoia tree, grizzly giant. One of Muir's main things at this time was to kind of understand what's going on here. You'll notice that there's some little green boxes there. Those little green boxes were actually given to the state of California in 1864 from the federal government to run Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoias. And probably the main topic of conversation with Muir and Roosevelt at that time was, let's make this also part of the national park. So there was actually like the equivalent of a state park in the middle of a national park in these two little instances. And so, yeah, Muir comes along in 1890. It pretty much puts in that blue line. But finally, what happens in 1905 is they make pretty much what the boundaries are, pretty close to today's boundaries. And that included everything that's in the white, including the valley and the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoia trees. But shortly after that, Muir does take off on his next big round-the-world trip in 1903, and he makes his way around the world there. That's his passport, which has a backstory to it, but I like reading it because it talks about his complexion. In fact, if you can read it, it actually says he has a ruddy complexion, broad forehead, ruddy complexion. So he sets off on this trip. That's him in Australia, looking at the grand tree, the eucalyptus tree. But he does come back, of course, and a few years later, another president says, hey, I want to go to Yosemite. And Muir says, I'll come with you. Does anybody want to guess why he's going? Why does Taft visit Yosemite with Muir in 1909? So this is about 10 years after that Roosevelt trip. Anybody want to guess why Muir really wants to meet with the president in 1909? I'll give you a moment to come up with this one. And I promise we're getting pretty close to the end here. It was this beautiful Hetch Hetchy Valley. Muir had written, damn Hetch Hetchy, as well as damn for water tanks, the people's cathedrals and churches, for no holier temple has ever been consecrated by the hearts of men. Unfortunately, the Raker Act was passed in 1913, and it was damned. Now, Muir was not anti-dam. He was just anti-putting a dam in a national park, especially in a valley like this one, this beautiful, basically twin of Yosemite Valley itself. But finally, Muir was still interested in traveling and science, and so he's kind of doing his sauntering thing. And this time he goes on a long trip to South America and Africa. On this trip, he's again really focused on the trees. He sees the Araucaria, I'm going to slaughter it, also known as the monkey puzzle tree. And then after South America, he goes to Africa, and he says, he later writes, he enjoyed one of the greatest of his great tree days of his lucky life when he finally visited the baobab tree. And that's that really large tree. This tree can get massive. It can get even larger than the giant sequoia. It can be like a 50-foot diameter base to it. So Muir finally got to see that. So yeah, and he also did a little bit of Samaritan work too. Muir went and visited his daughter in Southern California out in the deserts, a place called Daggett. And I'm going to read you this one little thing from the newspaper at the time. I kind of want to read it in that old newsreel voice, but Mr. Muir was visiting his daughter, Mrs. Helen Muir Funk, at Daggett. Doctors from Los Angeles determined to bring him to the city for treatment, and when he arrived here last night, Mr. Muir was in critical condition. John Muir had had pneumonia, and he died on Christmas Eve of 1914 when he was 76 years old. Story is, he had the manuscript for his Alaska trip all splayed out on his lap. So Muir, that's the end of Muir's life. So, we're kind of looking again at Muir. I'm looking at him as these three phases of life, that early sauntering when he writes things like, climb the mountains and get their good tidings. Then he's also a scientist. The mountains are calling, and I must go, and I will work on while I can, studying incessantly. And then lastly, the savior. Everybody needs beauty as well as bread, places to play in and pray in, where nature may heal and cheer and give strength to body and soul alike. So thank you. And remember, get out there and do your own sauntering, whether you're in the woods and wetlands of Chicagoland or if you're into the deep parts of Alaska. Continue to study and learn from Muir's own writings, from programs that you're getting here from the Sierra Club. And then lastly, continue to protect and care for the land, like your own Vernon Wildlife Corridor right there on the shores of Lake Michigan, all the way to a place like Yosemite. So thank you so much for listening to me, and I'll take any questions you've got. Thank you, June, for tuning in tonight.
Well, thank you very much. Rosemary, do you have any questions? I'm not seeing any.
No, I don't see any in the chat. Oh, here's one just came on from Chris. What is one way in which Muir went beyond thorough appreciation of nature and environment? He's our intellectual, Chris. Shall we close the screen so everyone can see?
You bet.
See everybody? Maybe that would be good. There you go.
This is a much deeper question that, and people have written articles and books about Muir's relationship with Thoreau and Emerson and things like that. And at the risk of copping out here, Chris, you've got a big question there. I think we could probably devote an entire symposium just to that question alone. But yeah, and you'd probably need somebody who knows a lot more about Emerson. So I'm going to beg off of that. I'm sure there are people on the call here that could give us much longer answers. But I would, if you ever want to give me a call sometime, I'd love to just have a long chat about that alone. You asked a big one. But, I guess I can tell a story here. Muir did meet Emerson. And, this is a very exciting time when he met Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson came to Yosemite. And as Muir put it, Muir was in the beginning of his life, and Emerson was in the sunset of his, or something like that, the evening of his life. And Muir really wanted Emerson to camp out underneath the giant sequoia trees and see what that was like. And they ended up putting Emerson into the hotel that was up there at the time, because it was a little hard. But Muir still went out into the trees and lit a big fire and watched the purple smoke come from these giant trees. So yeah, you've hit on something that it's like, wow, we could probably just, spend an entire hour just talking about that. So thank you for that question.
I'm not seeing any more, but thank you. I
Okay.
have a personal question. Do you camp out in
Yeah.
the national parks? Do you go out there and feel the nature?
Yeah, I do. A couple of things. We've got a cabin. Our family has a cabin that's right near the Calaveras Grove of giant sequoias. That's when he wrote that business about any fool can destroy trees. Um, I have a place near there. I get up to Yosemite at least once a week or 1 week a year volunteering for the Sierra Club if anybody's interested in doing that. The Yosemite Conservation Heritage Center in Yosemite Valley, you can volunteer there for a week. You work about 4 hours a day for 4 days, and the rest of the time you're out enjoying Yosemite in its grandeur. I'm sorry, about 5 days. And you just have a wonderful time. So I do that. Um, I've become a car camper. I'm trying to think of the last time I backpacked. It's been a very long time, but yeah, I try to get out. And where do people go in Chicago when you guys want to get out in nature? Where do you camp? I'll turn the tables on you.
There's a new park up in Wisconsin. It's
Uh-huh.
it follows the glacial
Nice.
path south. That's something. And then there's Starved Rock.
Great. Yeah.
Then we also have the Shawnee Forest at the south, at the
Mhm.
bottom of the state, and there is a movement to make that a national park.
Yeah.
It's full of problems because the loggers want to cut the trees down.
Oh my gosh.
And
Yeah.
there are also just wonderful things that happen. There's a snake migration
Oh wow.
twice a year, and they close the roads down so the snakes can cross the road and not be murdered by the cars. But
Yeah.
we find it. It's there. We have
Yeah.
wonderful forest preserves in Lake County. And I
Yeah.
know my husband and his red dog participate in that weekly, if not daily.
Yeah.
But I wanted to say I have used that quote in some of the
Ah.
about the trees and
Yep.
fools. I
Yep.
have actually put that in some of my program advertisements.
Well, I love that quote because the rest of it is just as important as any fool can cut down a tree. And that is, that this is left to the American people. It's our responsibility,
It
and that's
is,
pretty much what the Sierra Club has made it very clear. It's our responsibility. And I see a couple other comments in the chat. You mentioned the Glacier Trail in Wisconsin.
yes.
If I remember right, that comes near or right through Muir's land up there. And of course, the kettle moraines too. So,
Oh, yes, yes, it's wonderful. It's being developed. It's
yeah,
in process, and it's all being done by volunteers.
yeah,
But
so,
it's a good place to take a hike.
yeah.
Anybody else have ideas?
I'm seeing him in the chat.
They're quiet. We're getting older and we're not getting out as much.
Well, I put something in the chat
I
about the
think that's
boundary
great.
waters.
Oh, yeah, I didn't realize about it being under threat of copper mining or copper sulfate. Yeesh.
Copper mining, which what the main thing you'll learn is that sure there was iron mining, but when rain falls on iron, it turns to
Mhm.
rust. But when
Yeah.
water falls on the leavings of copper mining, it
Uh-huh.
turns into sulfuric acid.
Yeah.
And so there's an organization trying to fight off some of their own Minnesota representatives who are trying
Huh.
to get them, they're trying to get the federal government to prohibit that kind of a mine in such a
Huh.
delicate, fragile area.
Yep.
And of course, there's some interests even in Minnesota who say, well, it's jobs and this and that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a terrifying possibility.
That long the Muir quote about the long battle, something.
Hmm.
Got to continue to fight it. So
Yeah.
well,
Oh, and then of course the lakefront. We've got the lakefront in Chicago. Talk
yeah,
about
we
nature.
have the Chiwaukee Prairie now, which is
Yeah.
between the northern shore of Lake Michigan in Illinois and the southern shore in Wisconsin, and it's a vast.
Mhm.
It's really important for migrating birds.
Right.
we actually had a speaker talk about it. But we thank you so much. We
Yeah.
are so pleased that you came, and we hope that maybe we can participate with you again with
Yeah.
another talk. It just seems like I can't believe we are only getting to John Muir now. Really?
If you want a lot more, I've got,
Where have we been?
I've got one about his, travels in Yosemite, that drawing book that I was telling you about.
Will
and
you
one about the-
email me that information? I will send out the address for
Okay.
your program, and
You
I would
bet.
like to include that because people maybe didn't write it down. They were
Yeah.
hanging on your words and we didn't actually get it. Somebody has raised a hand.
Open
Harold.
up, Harold.
Oh, that's just me. I want to do a little advertising here because the
Please,
Sierra Club has a website called the John Muir Exhibit, and it doesn't have all the wonderful original stuff that you've seen with Mike. Mike's is fantastic because he has the original documents, but what we have is digital versions of all of John Muir's writings, plus dozens of writings about him by all kinds of people. And the Sierra Club has sponsored this for 20 years, 25 years, long time. It's about to be moved to a new platform, but it's still there. If you type in Google John Muir Exhibit Sierra Club, you will find a resource that's filled with all kinds of things about Muir and by Muir. It's just a recommended resource because, and a little self-aggrandizing, I'm the webmaster of it. I've been doing volunteer for it for 20 years. So if there's
my.
any input on how to help, let me know. But just a little advertising.
Oh, thank you, Harold. Will you send me an email and I will put that in?
Yeah, I'll put that in the chat too.
Yeah, I would
can-
like that, and then I will include that when I send out the text, the copy, the YouTube program from this. So at any rate, we thank you very much. And let's see, thank you for coming. This will complete our speaker series for the springtime. We will be having some programs coming up in the fall, September, October, November. Our local Lake County Woods and Wetlands will be presenting the work done by, I like to call it a sister group. The Audubon Society of Lake County does some wonderful work, and they have a program called Save Our Shores. We have been blessed to have some piping plovers nest up there along the shore in Waukegan, actually at the public beach. And they have done this for a couple years. Those little birds are just absolutely darling, and they're amazing and wonderful. Their natural history is beyond comprehension. How those tiny little things can migrate from here down to Florida or along the coast in Texas and then find their way back in the spring. So we will be having them come, I'm hoping for September. And that's the Lake County Audubon Society. Also, I'm hoping this is all in process, but did you know that there's a very lively bat organization that is connected with the Lincoln Park Zoo Urban Wildlife Institute, and they've been doing some work with citizen scientists. They actually connect little antennas to iPads, and they go out and find the bats down in the city, and they can identify them down to between two species. Bats are wonderful creatures, and they do a lot of good, and like all the creatures, they're having a hard time. So we're hoping to have them come. And then probably in November, we're going to have our very own Doug Orr, our boss, who has graciously agreed to share the real story behind nuclear energy and its potential future use as a safe, dependable source of energy. That story is not well told, and Doug has, I have actually strong-armed him into doing this. Thank you, Doug. So that's what we have on tap. Watch the Woods and Wetlands newsletter to get exact details for September, October, November. And again, thank you, Mike. Worst, say it, worst.
You got it.
For sharing these wonderful stories. You will all be receiving an email from me later this week, and that will have the YouTube program and also hopefully some information about books and resources. So thank you. Good night, everyone. Thank you for coming.